All right, here we go. Good friend, longtime cohort. He is from CBS Sports and the occasional co-host of One Bills Live. So you may have seen him on television, like you are now, and you certainly have heard him on the radio on WGR on a fairly regular basis. Chris Trapasso joins us. It's good to see you, Chris.
Hey, Rich. Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Of course, man. I see the Medina in the background, and we were talking a little bit before the taping. I'm like, wait. Are you from Medina? Do you live in Medina? We're like, oh yeah, I was there, and then I came back and met my wife. That's a cool little town, man. I've only been there once, but it was. Admittedly, I live in almost like Elma, which is about an hour from Medina,
Yep.
arguably, if
hmm
you're going to drive it. So I don't get up there that often, but the one time I did, it was an absolute blast. So good to have you on. Happy to see Medina doing well, and
hmm
let's get in some Bills chat. Let me start with sort of the obvious question that everyone after the game have been talking about. Two questions regarding Bass. Number one, did you think the Bills were going to kick a field goal when they did? And number two, knowing that he hit the 61-yarder, the Bills record, and people seem to forget that there was a 49-yarder kicked in that game as well. What's your level of confidence in his game at this point?
Well, to answer your first question, Rich, I wasn't that surprised just given the amount of time that was left. And obviously him making that kick has a higher percentage chance than, connecting on a Hail Mary from that point. There's one thing that we know about Tyler Bass is that he has that type of leg. Like coming out of Georgia Southern, it was the Bills are going to upgrade to go from Stephen Hauschka to Tyler Bass in terms of the distance at which they can kick field goals. So I wasn't crazy surprised that they did kick it. I actually was most concerned from a Bills perspective that it was going to get blocked because those obviously have to launch a little bit lower. And in terms of confidence level, I think it's a huge boost for him because, like you mentioned, to kick the 49-yarder earlier, yes, he did miss an extra point that just missed to the left, but I think it's a lot like golf where you just can't find your driver and then you hit two fairways in a row and suddenly your driver's the easiest club to hit in the bag. So I think late in the season last year, the field goal getting blocked in the first round of the playoffs against the Steelers kind of got him off kilter a little bit and didn't go into all those kicks with all that swagger that we hear so much about, and we have heard about through his entire NFL career. Making that 61-yarder, kind of getting literally carried off the field and so much adulation from the fans and his own teammates, I think does a world of good for Tyler Bass moving forward.
Great minds think alike because I made that golf comparison. And
Yep.
you know what? And you would know better than me because you're closer to the team than I am. But I know there's a special teams coach, but is there a particular kicking coach in-house that can work with him and talk about it? And my suggestion is hire a guy like a Mason Crosby or somebody to walk him through because he's got such a big leg. I feel like there are times when he overkicks, right? When he knows he's got this big, powerful leg, and for a 33-yard extra point, he wants to boom this thing. And sometimes he maybe kicks it too hard that to your point in golf, if you're hitting a 115-yard wedge or whatever you're hitting, that's a finesse shot. That's not a power shot, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's kind of what he needs at this point. What do you think?
So I think that does make sense. There's not a specific kicking coach that I know of. That doesn't mean that there isn't one. And again, maybe special teams coaches can kind of help out with technique and stuff. Kind of feels like to me though, and this is kind of a microcosm of how I feel about the entire NFL in terms of skills. Tyler Bass has the technique. He has the natural talent, the leg that we talked about. And I almost think just him getting reps and seeing the ball go between the uprights at this stage of his career, he's not learning where to put his plant leg or learning how to strike the football. He understands that he's kicked thousands of footballs in his life. It truly is, I want to say, not much more than just getting right in his headspace to, whether it's a 61-yarder to win the game, whether it's an extra point in the first quarter, to go in with as much confidence as possible to maximize those results for him.
Yeah. With Chris Trapasso, let's talk a little bit about, I want to talk some individual players. What do you think Von Miller is going to be?
So the last two times that we've seen him on the field, Baltimore before the suspension, and then this past week against the Dolphins, not a lot of production from him. But what I think, and this is probably me going back to my NFL draft roots, the traits have been there. The burst off the line, the bend around the corner. Last season, I did not see that. And I never really could tell, was it his injury? Was he a little hesitant coming off the torn ACL the year before? But he was almost like going half speed, like jogging on the field, did not have that. I don't see that type of Von Miller. I see more 2022 Von Miller. So in games that are tight where the Bills are looking for that closer that Brandon Beane has referenced so often, I think he can still be that guy, and he's still drawing attention with chips and double teams, and that obviously has a ripple effect across the entire Bills defensive line. Should the Bills expect him to be someone who's going to have 10 sacks down the stretch and be just wreaking havoc every game in the playoffs? Not necessarily, but I think in a pinch, in those pass rushing scenarios, I think he can do enough in some of those key moments, maybe not so much against the run, but to force quarterbacks to get rid of the football a little bit quicker than they want to.
So you mentioned the D line, and let's stay there. Trade deadline, Jordan Phillips and Jefferson both come back in acquisitions by the Bills. And we saw what the Dolphins did in their run game. I mean, they just gashed 149 yards on the ground, and Achane and Mostert were both terrific. And so was Wright as well. And now, of course, you go up against Jonathan Taylor, who, it has size, has speed, can break tackles, all of that. So what do you think? Obviously, with Smoot now on the IR with the wrist injury and Carter as well, what do you make of the acquisitions, and how much impact can they and do they need to have on the D line for this run game?
Yeah, on the surface, you would think, or I guess from afar, it would be not much, because Jordan Phillips really didn't do much late in the season last year in Buffalo, and then was with the Giants and the Cowboys, and didn't really look like that same player that really became a quality role player as this Josh Allen era really exploded from 2020 on. But I do think he understands the scheme. He understands angles and where he needs to be. And the Bills just need a big body. They need a Jordan Phillips-sized body. Quentin Jefferson, more of an upfield player. And I think more so than just narrowing it down to the Bills, whenever any team in the NFL is down 3 or 4 defensive linemen, there's just not a surplus of these quality players that are going to get you a ton of sacks and be great against the run. So you kind of have to dip into some deep insurance options. And we know the history of Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane. They like those players that have a firm grasp of the scheme, where maybe the physical traits aren't going to be there, but the Bills can rely that Jordan Phillips and Quentin Jefferson will most likely be in the right places at the right times when they need to be.
So guys like you, typically, and I that sometimes when that question is asked, it sounds bad, but guys that do your job, right, is to be an informant. Basically, you're informing the public of what's going on. And a lot of times guys like you, and this goes to the guys on ESPN and the guys on NFL Network, what do? They talk to agents a lot, right, for players, and they get a lot of their information from the agents. And I don't know if that's you or not, but I think a very puzzling part of this season for the Bills has been Mike Edwards. So here's a guy,
so puzzling,
right? Here's a guy, Tampa, Kansas City, championship teams, good player, solid player, comes in. You expect him to be a player. He's listed on the depth chart early on as a starter and gets released in week 9, whatever week we're in, 9 or 10, whatever week we're in, and just gets flat out released and doesn't really ever get on the field in terms of a safety role. He gets on the field in a special teams role. So what in God's name happened here?
I'm not sure. And this is something that we've seen during the Bills, Brandon Beane, Sean McDermott tenure, that they're pretty tight-lipped about these things. And we haven't seen too many of these. Quentin Spain was another one that came up, the former left guard that had a quick falling out and then just was suddenly released in the middle of a season. It's not really one of those organizations that lets a lot of these things slip, or when there is a great culture guy, you don't really hear too much about why someone was maybe retained when they maybe shouldn't have been. Mike Edwards, to me, was that whole scenario. I think it kind of started with him getting injured in training camp, that he kind of got behind the 8 ball in terms of learning the safety spot. We know that Sean McDermott asked so much of the safeties in terms of positioning. I mean, he was talking about it with defensive line. But part of why Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde were so good was not because they were freaky athletes or they were huge or the fastest guys on the field, but they understood how to play off each other so well. So maybe getting behind the 8 ball there in training camp, not being able to play for those couple of weeks at St. John Fisher University really didn't help Mike Edwards learn the system. But to erase some safety depth getting into the second half of the season when your other safety on the roster currently is a rookie in Cole Bishop was pretty surprising to me. And maybe we will see Micah Hyde, get that call from Brandon Beane here down the stretch.
One guy, let's stay on the safeties. That's kind of gotten ragged on. If you listen to some talk radio in Buffalo, a lot of people have ragged on Damar Hamlin a lot, and I'm not sure why. I mean, the whole premise of the Bills defense under Sean McDermott has been bend don't break, sort of the shell over the top, and they have not given up big plays typical to what Hyde and Poyer didn't give up. So I don't understand why Hamlin, why people are kind of like ragging on him, where he and Rapp seemingly are the two guys. They're in the top 4 in tackles almost every single week.
Yeah, Rich, that's a really good point. This is where I'm at on Damar Hamlin, that I think early on, again, because the Bills were going from 2 all-pro caliber safeties and everyone was expecting this huge dip. You maybe see one reception down the field allowed. Damar Hamlin's close to the football. It's like, oh, here we go. This guy's a 6th rounder. He's not really that good. But since like maybe week 1 or week 2, the further we go into this season and can leave a game and say, Damar Hamlin was not a liability in this game, he's piecing together a quality season. Like he has 2 interceptions. There has not been a game, again, really since early on. Maybe there was a play or 2 in that Baltimore game, but that was really true of a lot of defenders in that game where Hamlin looked out of position or missed a tackle or looked like he missed an assignment. I think he's playing sound football and very similar to Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer, but maybe not to the level of them in terms of productivity. Taylor Rapp and Damar Hamlin are playing very well off each other. And I've noticed Damar Hamlin, not too many missed tackles. When he comes down against an outside run or a screen, or he needs to wrap up on a shallow cross, whatever the case may be, not a lot of missed tackles. And I think that's probably part of the reason that he stayed on the field, because Sean McDermott wants to see his defensive backs tackle in space. And I think he's done a pretty good job this season.
For sure. Let me ask you about a couple of guys that have been injured and what you know about their injuries and, when they are expected to come back. Obviously Keon Coleman on the Poyer hit with the arm. He was seen in what looks like a cast, making a rookie appearance on his day off on Tuesday this week. And then Benford. What are you hearing about those 2 guys?
It seems like Christian Benford is going to probably play on Sunday. As for Keon Coleman, it would be surprising. Do I think the Bills are just like, hey, let's just give him a week's rest? No, I think they understand that, playoff seeding matters and they're trying to chase down the Chiefs and stay in that at least number 2 seed, which we're going to start to talk about playoff seeds here down the last half of the season. But I think it would be surprising if Keon Coleman were to play on Sunday, but not to necessarily go back into the, adage that we heard all offseason about everybody eats. But last week, the Bills scored 30 points without Amari Cooper. Now they're potentially or probably going to be down Keon Coleman. Maybe this is another opportunity for Curtis Samuel, who hasn't really done much. Dawson Knox, same thing. Amari Cooper should probably be back on the field. So it is good that the Bills are now seeing how valuable it can be to have depth at receiver where you're not just funneling the offense through one player.
Can I know it's been injury for the most part, at least in the last couple of weeks, but I'm going to throw Curtis Samuel into the Mike Edwards bin because he is baffling, the fact that he has just not been used at all in the offense. And I know he's been banged up. He's had the toe and some other things. But I was convinced at the deadline, knowing that if you go down the roster of, I'll call them receivers, right? And not just purely wide receivers, but you're talking Shakir, you're talking Coleman, you're talking Mac Hollins, Kincaid, Knox, Cook, Davis. There's 7 receivers right there. I was pretty surprised that Curtis Samuel, unless the Bills had no offers or asks of him, I was surprised he wasn't moved. And I understand the contract and all of that, but I was kind of surprised he wasn't moved. And I also know he was injured. You can't move an injured guy. But what do you make of his deal?
You know what? That's a really good point that I hadn't heard anyone thinking of that, but Deontay Johnson just got traded to the Carolina Panthers, and he was moved like 8 games into his Panthers career. Obviously, different situation record wise, and where both of those organizations are. So it wouldn't have been crazy. And maybe we'll never know if some teams called the Bills and said, hey, it doesn't seem like you're utilizing Curtis Samuel. Like, we'll send you a day 3 pick for him. And the Bills said no. We'll never know. Maybe that's a possibility. It's been really surprising to me because we heard all about the connection to Joe Brady in Carolina. The career year happened with Joe Brady in Carolina. What I've noticed on film, and I don't know if this is something that's the Bills are trying to kind of keep him under wraps or hide this portion of the offense, besides the gimmicky Isaiah McKenzie type stuff early in the season, most of the time when Curtis Samuel has been on the field, and it has not been very often since he's come back from that toe injury, when Josh Allen's dropping back to pass, if Curtis Samuel is on the left side of the field, Josh Allen's first read, right side of the field, and vice versa. It's not like he's the number one read in the progression. Really, the only game that we got to see that a little bit was the Monday night win over the Jets, where I think he had 3 catches. He had the one downfield, down the left sideline on kind of a scramble drill. So for a player that is getting paid more than any other receiver on the roster, it is surprising that he's not more featured and more of the first or second read in this offense. Let's see if that changes it all and the Bills kind of evolve their offense in the second half of this regular season.
Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, considering those 2 names, Edwards and Samuel, I mean, what some people might think, and don't get me wrong, the Bills are 7-2 and they look very good right now, right? But like for the people that are questioning the acquisitions, what would you say to that? Like if they're questioning Brandon Beane and saying, wait a minute, these are 2 guys who are veterans who have been productive in the league. They come to your team. You go out and seek them and sign them, and they don't even make the field. Like, is it okay to sort of second guess the GM here?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to realize that as a GM, it's kind of like baseball, that if you're batting 300 or 400, you're doing something right. I mean, there's whether that's draft picks, free agent signings, trades, not going to hit every single one. And I think Brandon Beane would be the first one to kind of say, hey, like we didn't have or that wasn't a good signing. Signing Mike Edwards wasn't a good fit for whatever reason. And there's probably things behind the scenes. And if things don't change with Curtis Samuel, although obviously with him still being on the roster and being talented and with the connection to Joe Brady, I'm still holding out some hope that he can become a bigger part of the offense. And maybe it starts this weekend against the Colts.
Okay, excellent segue. What do you make of this game? I mean, it is definition trap game with Kansas City the following week. I mean, basically the midseason Super Bowl is the week after. I mean, this is definition trap game. So what do you make of the Colts game?
Well, you said off air to me, and I think it was spot on, that they're kind of a mysterious team. Like everything with the Anthony Richardson, Joe Flacco saga, like that's one thing. But it's if you ask even a pretty fervent NFL fan, name some players on the Colts. It's all right, Jonathan Taylor, and it's hard on both sides of the football. Have a pretty good offensive line. Quentin Nelson obviously is there. What I think fans need to know is this is a good defensive line, especially on the interior. Grover Stewart and DeForest Buckner truly might be the best defensive tackle tandem in the AFC. They're totally different players. Buckner's like a bigger version of Greg Rousseau. He's tall, will get up the field, uses his long arms very well. Grover Stewart is kind of like, to use a throwback, like a Ted Williams or a Sam Adams type of big, bulky nose tackle.
That would be
really
Ted Washington. Yeah, Ted Williams.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, kind of mix those together there. Ted Washington, Sam Adams. That big type of nose tackle, girthy, great run defender. So running against this team up the middle, and we know the Bills have been one of the run heavier teams, or run heavier than they've been, is not going to be a piece of cake. In terms of the pass rush and the secondary, I think they are vulnerable there, and we've seen some teams move the football very well. And if you get after Joe Flacco, you can see, what we would expect Joe Flacco would be at this stage of his career. If you let him sit and scan from in the pocket because of that strong arm, and he's aggressive and he's kind of playing with, hey, what do I have to lose? I'm going to throw this football. He can make some plays and still throw an accurate ball. So that's kind of the defensive line and keeping Joe Flacco clean. 2 keys for the Colts on defense and offense that the Bills need to come.
Yeah, I looked up one thing.
And yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
Whether it's hold on to the football with coverage disguises. not trying to football a bunch up the middle because of those two elite at defensive.
What do you make of Jonathan Taylor at this point in his career? He's had some injury issues, but of course, wasn't that long ago when he had a career day against the Bills.
Yeah, I mean, he's still to me in terms of just pure physical talent, elite at the running back position. The injuries maybe have sapped a little bit of that. What is key to this game that I saw early in the week, and maybe as we ramp up to this game, we'll hear more about it. Their starting center, Ryan Kelly, who was a former first-round pick out of Alabama, got injured last week. I think they placed him on IR. He's not going to play this week against the Bills. That's huge. I mean, Quentin Nelson is a perennial All-Pro. Bernard Raymond, young left tackle, is a pretty quality player, but to not have your kind of pivot man who's like one of the bigger, stronger centers is going to hurt Jonathan Taylor in this game. So he's still talented. He can break off a long run here and there, but he's not quite as dynamic and explosive as he was when he had that huge day against the Bills 2 or 3 years ago.
One more Bills question before I want to go a little bit around the AFC with you, but so Josh, in parts of the second half, there were a lot of throws that were not good, like underthrows. Whoa. And I'm wondering if you're hearing anything about that, because there wasn't one, there was a bunch in that second half.
I haven't heard anything about it. I've kind of texted around, and there doesn't seem to be, just within the Bills organization, any concern that there's an injury or there's a mechanics problem. And I went back to watch most of those on film. A lot of them were from, and we know Josh Allen is as good as any quarterback at completing these passes in most scenarios, from muddy pockets where his forward step was kind of shortened by either a lineman getting pushed into him or a defender coming in close. There really wasn't a ton of wind, so I don't think it was that. If it continues, then it will probably pop up as a question in a press conference, but I didn't take too much from that game, although you're right that those throws, especially late in the game, a few throws into the flat that kind of died at its target that usually don't. I think it was more just about wasn't able to fully step into the throw like he's used to.
That makes sense. Okay, I'll take that. All right, so let me ask you about Kansas City. How much better are they? I mean, obviously they lose Rice, they lose Hollywood Brown. I mean, they lose Pacheco. They're way down in terms of skill players, but they do add Hopkins, and he was fantastic against Tampa. I mean, how much better are they now with him in the lineup?
They're definitely better, and here's why. I think Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes are so good. I mean, Andy Reid is so good at designing plays to get players open, regardless of if it's Justin Watson or whoever it is, or it is a Rashee Rice or a Hollywood Brown. And Patrick Mahomes is so adept at finding those players in a hurry to mitigate the pass rush. What DeAndre Hopkins gives them, I don't even care about his route running ability. Yes, he'll be able to get open against some lesser corners. I don't think he has nearly as much juice or sharpness in that regard as he did even like 2 years ago. It's what we saw on that downfield throw, I think in like the second or third quarter, kind of on a scramble drill, made an incredible catch right in front of Antoine.
Coverage.
Yeah, triple coverage. Coming down with the football in those scenarios, that's where I think the Chiefs didn't really have that. They didn't have that player. Last year, obviously, with all the drops, was a huge problem for that offense when they sputtered. So more so than getting this elite route runner who's just going to get open every play. I don't know if that's going to be the case. But when in doubt now, Patrick Mahomes can say, hey, this guy doesn't really look open, but I'm going to throw it. And DeAndre Hopkins, despite some of his athleticism being kind of deteriorated at this point, like it does for every receiver, the hands are certainly still there.
For sure. Other than Kansas City and Baltimore, I mean, I think those are next to the Bills. You know, if there was a top three, the holy trinity of the AFC, that's what they would be, right? Then, like for me, I still think the Bengals are something. The Texans, the Chargers, and Pittsburgh, right? For me, that's the top seven in the conference. So amongst the Bengals, Texans, Chargers, and Pittsburgh, and if there's somebody else you want to throw in the AFC, feel free. But of those four that I just mentioned, who do you think is going to come out the best, you know, when this is all said and done, and is maybe the biggest challenge to those top three teams I mentioned?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the Bengals, and obviously they have a huge game on Thursday night against the Ravens, which will it's not going to determine anything, but it will be a good measuring stick for both of those teams right now. And it could really be this situation where the AFC North really just beats up on each other all season. To me, it's probably the Texans. And I know they haven't looked great the last 2 weeks. I've watched all of CJ Stroud's throws, back-to-back kind of bad performances, but no Nico Collins, suddenly no Stephon Diggs. But they will get Nico Collins back at some point here in the next coming weeks. And he was leading the NFL in receiving. He catches that 75-yard touchdown against the Bills, hurts his hamstring, haven't seen him since. The reason I'm saying that, though, beyond Stroud and how good he is kind of throwing from, like I said, with Josh Allen, tight pockets where there's a lot of players around him and can still make accurate throws on the run, things like that. The defense, to have Danielle Hunter, Will Anderson, I trust D'Amico Ryans with confusing quarterbacks with disguising coverages, similar to what Sean McDermott does. So the Bengals have had this bugaboo with their defense this year that they've allowed a lot of big plays outside of Trey Hendrickson. They don't have a great pass rusher. If I have to kind of rank these by defense, and it would definitely be that Houston, I think, can really get after it a little bit more than any of those other teams.
Interesting. So right now, this is maybe the toughest question of the entire interview. Who is in the Super Bowl?
I think the Lions are a true juggernaut in the NFC, and we're starting to see kind of the cream rise to the top. Like the Eagles have played better a little bit. There's a few good teams in the NFC West, but with the offensive line that they have, Ben Johnson designing plays, so much yards after the catch. Sam Laporta hasn't even really gotten going yet. Amon-Ra St. Brown is catching balls even at a higher rate than Khalil Shakir, which seems impossible. Jared Goff's really in the zone. I mean, talk about confidence. Like, it seems like every time he drops back, he's finding someone open. So they, to me, seem like a team that's going to be really hard to beat in those, if they have to even go on the road in the playoffs, because they have such a good offensive line. The defense should be just good enough because they can score so many points.
I was going to say, they just add Zadarius Smith. My God,
they add Zadarius Smith. They needed to do that. I'm glad that they made that move after losing Aiden Hutchinson. And right now, I think really from the AFC, it's a toss up between the Baltimore Ravens or the Buffalo Bills. And I'm not picking the Chiefs, which I know seems like counter to everything. They're undefeated. They're the back-to-back Super Bowl champions, but over time, you can't expect to continue to win these games where you're just leaving teams in it. If they played the game that they played against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers against the Bills are winning that game. And there have been games like against the Raiders the week before where Gardner Minshew was right there toward the end of the game. This is not a Chiefs team that's been blowing a lot of teams out. And I think Andy Reid would say, hey, we need to play better football. So I think maybe that will change. Maybe they'll get into a groove with DeAndre Hopkins. And maybe they will even beat the Bills in a couple weeks, but in the playoffs, to go through all the way, you have to be really firing on all cylinders. The Bills know you can't just lay an egg in a first half like they did against the Bengals a few years ago. You're out of the playoffs. So to me, for a team that is 8-0, I'm not as quite as high on the Kansas City Chiefs as even a club that has slipped up a little bit a few times, like the Bills and the Baltimore Ravens.
All right, so this has been an issue with my interview skills over the years, is especially when I'm with people that are, I say, hey, I need you for 15 or 20 minutes. And then my guest says something and it extends the interview longer than it should be.
That's me, though. That's me. That's all me.
So you just said something to me that I thought was very, very interesting. As we progress throughout the season and into the playoffs, the Bills have not been a good first half team in all year long. So what do you make of that? And like you said, if they get wherever they get into the playoffs, most likely the divisional round, obviously, because they should win the division. But based on the way the playoffs are set up now, they would have to play in the first round. Whatever. If they have a bad first half against a playoff team, that probably doesn't bode well, despite the fact they've been great in the second halves against particular teams.
Yeah, it's really hard to pinpoint why that's happened. And to me, what it runs counter to any logic to me. They have the whole week to plan, to get the first 15 plays, to watch all the film of the opposing offense. I'm not going to say it's happened every week, but it's been the majority of the time they've kind of laid an egg in the first half. They go in in the locker room for 12 minutes and they come out and they can drop 34 points in the second half and allow 3 points. Like, I don't understand how that's happened. And I would assume that at one Bills drive, that is something that Sean McDermott, Bobby Babbitt, Joe Brady have really been hammering home, that when you see the Bills get off to a fast start like they did against the Jaguars or the Titans or the Seahawks, those 3 games are really the only ones. You see what they can ultimately do. Now, those teams aren't maybe as good or as, playoff caliber clubs that they're going to play in January, but that is probably the most important thing. Not just playing good football by the end of the season, which has been really echoed over and over the last couple of years. We all know that. It's erasing those slow starts. They don't necessarily have to start 17-0 at the end of the first quarter winning, but just not being down 13-3 like they were, let's see, to the Chargers last year in that Peacock game. Things like that, I think, is key for this team that has really shown over multiple seasons. The halftime adjustments are good, and if Josh Allen is down in the second half, he will his team to get back in the game. But you're right, against the Bengals, Chiefs, Ravens, Texans, whoever it may be, you cannot do that in the playoffs. It would waste another really good Bills season.
Okay, lastly, I didn't ask you for a prediction. I'm assuming you think the Bills are going to beat the Colts.
I do think they're going to win. I think it could be another one of those. I don't want to say necessarily a slow start for the Bills, but maybe not a runaway game to start. But I think they'll be able to confuse Joe Flacco enough, get in his face a little bit, to maybe intercept 2 or 3 passes potentially, or just get them off the field a little bit more frequently than some other teams have earlier in the season against the Colts. And as long as they understand that they can't run the football 30 times up the middle, which I'm hoping game plan wise for Buffalo, they'll understand they can't do that. They should be able to leave Lucas Oil Stadium with the victory.
Man, that would be unbelievable. They'd be
first time they would be 8-2 since 92. I saw that today.
Yeah, it's crazy. And and McDermott now has his 80 wins in 10 years, or in 8 years rather, 10 wins a year, which is a pretty epic mark. But you know what? All that being said, 100 years from now, looking back, if you don't win a Super Bowl with all of those numbers, it doesn't mean as much, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's like Sean McDermott feels like he has the most, or one of the most secure jobs in the NFL. But if they go, what would it be, 4 years in a row losing in the divisional round at the prime of Josh Allen? I'm not going to say that I'll be calling for him to be fired, but it'll be harder for me to tell his critics, you're crazy. He's a great coach. Like, you keep getting there. You play great in the regular season. Awesome in December. He's only lost 2 games in December in the regular season the last 4 or 5 years. You got to get it done, especially Josh Allen at age 28, showing that he can play outside of structure as well as any quarterback, and now within the structure and dink and dunking the football down the field. We never thought we could see that from Josh Allen. So he's really become the complete quarterback. You got to get it done. And I would say at least get to an AFC title game. But like you're saying, of course, like everyone in Buffalo wants, ultimately winning that Lombardi trophy.
And I would agree with you. And I've mentioned this before in this show, that Josh, I think, in my opinion, for the first time in his career, looks more relaxed than he ever has. And it's showing. It's absolutely showing. Chris, for people watching, please give your socials out there so people can follow and be part of what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Chris Trapasso, and I do a lot of film videos on TikTok. I just love it's very easy to make film videos and talk over them. So follow me on there, and then every day I come out with a new article Monday through Friday on CBSSports.com.
And you love talking football, and that's why it's great having you on, because you are not only really well versed in what you're talking about, but you can see it in the way you present yourself that you love what you do. So I appreciate you doing this, man. Great to see you, and continue the great work.
Thanks, Rich. Appreciate it, man.
You got it.